Assalamu alaikum. This is Brother Hameed with the Muslim Empowerment Institute, and today I'll be giving a brief response to the contemporary Black conscious community or Afrocentric community or Hoteps or whatever term you want to use in light of their very apparent vitriol against religion that's been occurring recently. Now, first I need to mention that a lot of this anti-religious stance stuff from amongst these individuals came about as a result of the publications and lectures by Black American scholars such as Chancellor Williams, Dr. John Henry Clark, and others. Now, their works insinuate that what we call religion or spirituality existed in the African continent prior to Judaism or prior to Christianity and prior to Islam. They depict that the early adherents of these religions were non-indigenous invaders that destroyed our African civilizations, and that they forced on us these foreign religions, and that they actually borrowed from African spirituality in order to create these religions. Now, this understanding began to be more widespread around the mid to late 1970s after the departure of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, who was a trailblazer of Black consciousness in America. Actually, if it wasn't for him, you wouldn't even have Black consciousness in America or Islam within the Black American community. Now, there may have been a few other people, but Elijah Muhammad was the one who made this thing popular. Now, you'll find that a lot of the elders in the Black conscious community were former sympathizers or formerly in the Nation of Islam under Elijah Muhammad. So when his son Imam Warfdi Muhammad took over the nation in 1975 and made the transition into quote-unquote Orthodox Islam, a lot of folks just couldn't take it. Now, you were already told that Christianity was the white man's religion, so they just threw Islam in the pot as well. So people grew locks, put on dashikis, and started reading the very limited literature that was available at the time about ancient Kemet, and folks started studying voodoo and other African spiritual systems. So that's how that came about. Now, I like to call the folks in the conscious community the wannabe Wakandans, because the recent blockbuster film, The Black Panther, which was an excellent film, the protagonist of the film, T'Challa, which is Allah spelled backwards by the way, the T actually represents the cross and the C is for Christ, and that's not an accident. He's the king of a fictional country in Africa called Wakanda, and this country is supposed to be highly advanced technologically speaking. But one of the things that's so easy to notice is that despite fictional Wakanda being so advanced and wealthy, their religious or spiritual ideologies is entrenched in ancestor veneration, monkey deities, and stuff like this. And they're trying to insinuate that out of all the African countries, the most successful one, mythical Wakanda, were on some paganism, as if idolatry and paganism is as African as chicken yassa. So the wannabe Wakandans have been apparently invigorated by the film, and a party of them who are extremely vile and vulgar and disrespectful and blasphemous had put out some type of lecture that they charge money for, bashing religion, or more specifically bashing Islam. Now, I haven't heard that much from these guys, but I can imagine that what they presented was nothing new by any means, because anti-Islamic or anti-religious rhetoric is not new at all. Europeans have put out a lot of this information, and I can guarantee that many of their alleged proofs and evidences came from the Europeans. Now, how ironic is that? You don't really think that some Negroes from the hood went overseas to learn the Arabic language or learn any other language for that matter outside of English in order to base their arguments on primary sources, do you? I mean, because if you want to successfully refute someone, you have to refute them with proofs such as a historical document or a manuscript or something like this, not just using the secondary sources of folks who came around 100 years later. But the European is believed to be your enemy, yet you base your arguments off of him. How many people actually trust their enemy? But I guess we shouldn't be surprised at that, because your concept of Ma'ad, or what you think Ma'ad is based on the Europeans' explanation. Since if you give your explanation of the hieroglyphs, it's going to be based upon your own opinion, and not that you actually study with an adherent of a so-called Kemetic religion that's not acknowledged by anyone on the planet except some Negroes from the hood who don't know any better. I mean, come on. If we were to go to Egypt right now, we won't find anyone practicing the Kemetic religion. Now that should be a red flag right there. Oh, it's because the pale Arabs forced Islam on us and destroyed our African civilizations. Really? The Kemetic religion hasn't been practiced in thousands of years. I mean, do you really understand this? It's dead. But I'm sorry, I'm aiming this at some folks who believe in worshiping their ancestors, and of course, they're dead too. Or if you look at it in another way, your ancestors are actually alive within you. You are your ancestors. Their DNA runs through you. So venerating your ancestors is actually venerating yourself. So instead of calling on your ancestors, just call on yourself. That makes more sense than calling upon someone that passed away. Or better yet, call upon the one who created you and your ancestors, since he's ever living and wasn't born and never dies. But these folks don't want to do that. They feel like they can't worship something they can't see, something they can't touch or smell. You don't want to worship the one God whom existed before his creation. Oh, so if God created everything, then who created him? That's one of those self-contradictory questions that the Greeks used to pose a lot. The question itself is invalid because the definition of a creation is something that has a beginning or an ending. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't have a beginning or an ending. Hence, he is not a creation. Hence, he is the creator. And no one created him. You understand that? See, your problem is shirk. Shirk in Arabic literally means to share. So you're sharing attributes of the creation that belong specifically to the creator, or you're sharing attributes with the creator that belong specifically to the creation. That's our people's problem right there, shirk. Shirk is ascribing partners to God. We don't understand this. We don't want to understand his rububiyyah, his uluhiyyah, and his al-asma wa sifat, his lordship, his godhood, and his perfect names and attributes. If you really understood your creator, you wouldn't go around asking some dead folks for nothing. Honoring them is one thing. Asking them for stuff after they died is another. And then many of the folks in the unconscious community are atheists. Now, how is that African? I never heard of any African civilization that didn't have a concept of a higher power. So since you have a false sense of history that you think that Europeans forced religion on Africans and forced God on Africans, that you're going to just reject the whole concept of God altogether. Now, how'd you get here? To create means to bring something from non-existence into a state of existence. Did you create yourself? Or somebody else did? Do you really think that this intelligent design happened by chance? Science tells us about the Big Bang Theory, where the atoms fused together and the cosmos came into existence as a result. Atoms fusing together is an event. So who created the atoms and who initiated the event? You say it just happened by itself. Well, a thing has to be in order to do. If the atoms existed before they fused together, someone had to first create the atoms and then will for them to fuse together. Because they didn't decide by themselves to exist, then they didn't decide by themselves to fuse together. Just like there's no design without a designer, no writing without a writer, no painting without a painter, no creation without a creator. Common sense. And then you're telling everybody that we're African. See, folks like to take advantage of the fact that black folks in America have an innate longing for an identity and knowing where we come from, even though it's impossible to know definitively where we come from. We just can't accept being black Americans. We got to be Africans, even though real Africans laugh at you when you say this. I mean, your ancestors been in this country for 200 to 300 years and you're still an African. You don't have African culture, you don't do what Africans do, and you're still an African. And ain't no Africans ever coming to America to save you, and definitely no one from Wakanda. And then why do you claim ancestors that aren't yours? The transatlantic slave trade involved West Africans, not ancient Egyptians. See, our problem as black folks is that We adopted this man-made concept of race that also came from Europeans, by the way. We fail to understand that the continent of Africa has 1,500 to 2,000 languages and over 3,000 ethnic groups. So since we don't know definitively where our African ancestors came from, we conveniently pick and choose which ones we want to claim in a true inferiority complex fashion. We claim any and every African civilization as long as they didn't have a religion, because we believe that religion came from outside of the continent. Look at it this way. You have dozens of different tribes in Nigeria alone, and it's usually taboo for someone to marry outside of their tribe, like a Hausa marrying a Fulani. They don't consider themselves the same even if they look the same and are from the same country and even speak the same official language. But you, since you've been robbed of your history, your culture, and knowledge of self, you just claim any and everything as long as it's not a religion. Now let me break this down about the Arab slave trade and this notion that Islam destroyed our African civilizations. First off, Arabia was a colony of Habasha, the land of present-day Ethiopia and Somalia and that region in East Africa. When the Arab Muslims were being persecuted by the pagan Arabs, they sought refuge in Habasha from the king Negus. Now, if the Arabs didn't have friendly relationships with Ethiopia, then they wouldn't have sought refuge there. Make sense? Now, slavery predates Prophet Muhammad and the Quran. The Arabs enslaved each other, the Arabs enslaved Africans, and the Africans enslaved Arabs. It is what it is. Slavery was a global phenomenon. The Europeans enslaved each other as well. And you know who actually enslaved your West African ancestors and sold them into slavery? You guessed it. It was the other West Africans. And Europeans would simply buy slaves from them, and these guys know that, but they just lying to you. They're just lying to our people. So you have a problem with Arabs enslaving Africans, but don't have a problem with Africans enslaving Africans. It's kind of like the police shootings of unarmed black folks. You know, you don't want to go out there and march when blacks kill each other, but you want to do all this marching when some police officers shoot you. Africans enslaved Africans, plain and simple. And slavery occurred in Kemet, plain and simple. And even if some white Arabs enslaved Africans and misused religious texts in order to justify, just like whites in America did, that doesn't mean that God co-signed on that. It's just misuse of religious texts. Now, geographically speaking, Arabia is northeast Africa. The only thing separating it is the Red Sea. The folks were black on both sides of the Red Sea. They had similar phenotypes, the same animals, the same flora and fauna, the same religious traditions. So how did they become white? Well, when the Arab Muslims conquered the Persians and the Romans, they acquired countless slaves, and they had an unfortunate affinity for European concubines. They had many children with these women, and according to Arab culture, which was patrilineal, where the child took on the tribe and culture of the father, those what we call mixed race kids ended up having the same affinity for European concubines. And within less than 100 years, the original Arabs almost genetically annihilated themselves. The Abbasid Khilafah, who were originally the mixed race children of the Arabs, ended up leading the way for the Persianization of Islam. They took over from the first dynasty in Islam, the Umayyads, who were the original black Arabs. The Umayyads fled into Africa and absorbed a lot of the cultures that they encountered. These were the folks who in 711 went into the Iberian Peninsula and conquered the Visigoths. From then on, the black Arabs and African Moors brought civilization to Europe. And some of the remnants actually went into West Africa as well. Next, they say that Islam borrowed from what is called Judaism. Now, a person would have to ask himself, why would God reveal different religions that take from the same source? Well, that's easy. Because he didn't. All of the prophets were Muslims, and they all had the same religion, Islam. So during the time of Moses, when people became Muslims, they would bear witness that no one is God except Allah, and Moses is the messenger of Allah. During the time of Jesus, when the people became Muslims, they will bear witness that no one is God except Allah, and Jesus is the messenger of Allah. And finally, during the time of Prophet Muhammad, when people became Muslims, they would say no one is God except Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. So by them saying that Islam borrowed from previous revealed religions as a result of similarities, that's not necessarily false, because they all come from the same source, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So yes, in ancient Egypt, they prayed and prostrated. During the time of Moses, they prayed and prostrated. During the time of Jesus, they prayed and prostrated. During the time of Muhammad, and so on and so forth, they prayed and prostrated. That makes perfect sense. Why would God name a revealed religion Judaism, named after a tribe, or Christianity, named after a person, or Hinduism, named after a tribe, or Buddhism, named after a person? Does it make sense to say that perhaps their religion was one, and Europeans may have named the religions after the people themselves? That's why I know you got that whole Mohammedanism thing from the Europeans. Next thing, you want to say that the Quran forbids making sculptures of God because the Arabs didn't have the knowledge of sculpting and doing the architecture of their deities. Well, it's because to make statues of an object with the intention of worshiping the object is shirk. It's idol worship. What if the object breaks? What you gonna worship then? I suppose you just take a hiatus until you build another idol. Then you'll commence to worshiping it again. That's just dumb. Just because it's African don't mean it's good. Lastly, a lot of folks in the unconscious community don't understand the system of white supremacy. Yes, white supremacy has impacted all religions, including Islam. But instead of rejecting the white supremacist expression in religion, you reject religion altogether. And then you're left with no moral code, no discipline, no system of governance, no system to take care of the poor in the society, no way of governing how to do marriage and divorce, nothing but total chaos. These brothers and sisters need to think about that. Didn't Nat Turner reject white supremacy in religion? The same Bible used to justify slavery, he used it to justify his freedom. Was he wrong for rejecting the slave master's interpretation of Christianity? Well, how about this? Why don't you reject the slave master's interpretation of Kemet? Because that's exactly where you got it from. No one can really decipher the Kemetic scrolls, and you ain't got access to it anyway. The European is only going to give you the adulterated version after he altered the text. So all you can do is rely on your slave master to explain it to you. Plain and simple. What saves Islam is the preservation of the Quran, which is in its original language, and Arabic is not a dead language like the Kemetic language that hasn't been spoken in thousands of years. Then you got vegetarianism. Guess what? Vegetarianism ain't African. They eat meat in every country in Africa if it's available, except maybe some parts in Ethiopia. Folks should eat meat in moderation and make sure that they're eating a humanely slaughtered animal that had a good diet. Plain and simple. I mean, so the European introduced eating meat to Africa as well. Well, some of you are thanking the European for that one. But anyways, there's a lot more that I can say on this topic. Meanwhile, you gotta wake up, wannabe Wakandans. Please like and subscribe to this channel and share this video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.